My son said, "We were going for a drive, but he took me to see a nursing home. I thought my son wanted to spend the day with me. He smiled at me the way he used to when he was a little boy, said we'd drive without any destination, just the two of us, like old times. I wore my favorite saree. I brought the necklace my husband gave me before he passed. For a few miles, I was the happiest mother in the world. Then the car stopped in front of a building I never asked to see. I spent 36 years in this country, giving everything I had, so my son could have a life I never got to live. I skipped meals so he could eat. I worked every job nobody else wanted so he could go to school. And when my body finally started asking for a little help, when my knees ached climbing stairs and my hands searched for glasses that were already on my head, I found out my own son had already decided, without asking me a single question, where the rest of my life would happen. What I did next in that parking lot, alone, at 76 years old, is something I never imagined myself capable of. This is my story, and I promise you, it doesn't end the way you think it does. I never thought old age would feel like an apology I had to keep making. Not for something I did wrong, but simply for existing. For taking up space in a house I helped build with my own hands. For needing a little more help than I used to. Nobody warns you about that feeling when you're young. You spend your whole life giving and giving and giving, believing that love is something you can bank, like money, and that one day, when you're tired and your knees ache and your eyes are too weak to thread a needle, that love will come back to you the way you gave it. I believed that with my whole heart, and I was wrong. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is where I started and what it cost me to get to where I am now. I was born in a small town in the south of India, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the smell of jasmine flowers drifted through the streets in the evening, and where a woman's worth was measured by how well she could serve her family. I never resented that life. I loved it, in its own way, but I always felt there was something more waiting for me, somewhere far from the narrow lanes and the watchful eyes of neighbors who counted every mistake you made. I got married young, the way most girls did back then. My husband was a quiet man, hard-working, with dreams bigger than our little town could hold. He used to sit on the veranda at night and tell me about America, about opportunity, about a country where a person's effort mattered more than their family name. I didn't understand it fully then. I just knew I trusted him, and I loved him enough to follow him anywhere. 36 years ago, we left everything behind. I remember standing at the airport, holding a single suitcase that contained my whole life folded into cotton saris and a photograph of my parents. I remember my mother crying, gripping my hands like she was trying to memorize the feeling of them because she knew, somehow, that she might never hold them again. She was right. I never got to see her before she passed. That is a wound that never fully closes, no matter how many years go by. America was not what I expected. It was colder, both in weather and in the way people moved through their days, heads down, always rushing towards something. My husband and I worked constantly. He took whatever jobs he could find, driving, warehouse work, anything that paid. I started working in restaurants, washing dishes, waiting tables, learning to smile through exhaustion because a tired face didn't earn tips. Later, I moved into housekeeping at hotels, and eventually, when I was older, I began working as a caregiver for elderly people in their homes. There is something strange about that. Looking back, I spent years of my life caring for other people's aging parents, bathing them, feeding them, sitting with them through their loneliest hours, long before I understood what it would feel like to be the one who needed care. Every dollar I earned, I saved. Not for myself, for my son. My son was born 4 years after we arrived in this country, and from the moment I held him, I understood the true reason I had crossed an ocean. It wasn't for me. It was for him. I wanted him to have chances I never had, an education that opened doors, a life free from the struggle that had defined mine. I skipped meals sometimes so there would be more in his lunchbox. I wore the same 3 saris for years so there would be money for his tutoring. I worked double shifts, my back aching, my hands cracked from years of dish soap and cleaning solutions. And I never once complained in front of him. I wanted him to see only strength. I wanted him to believe that his mother could handle anything because I needed him to believe that his own dreams were possible too. He grew into a brilliant young man. He studied hard, went to a good university, and eventually built a successful career and a family of his own. I remember the day he told me he had gotten his first real job, the kind with a good salary and a future. I cried so hard I couldn't speak. All those years of sacrifice suddenly felt worth something tangible. I used to tell my friends in the community, with so much pride in my voice, that my son was proof that everything I had given up meant something. My husband passed away 8 years ago. A heart attack, sudden, no warning. One evening, he was sitting beside me watching television, laughing at something silly, and by morning, he was gone. I won't pretend that grief doesn't still visit me sometimes. In quiet moments, when I smell his cologne on an old shirt I never gave away, or when I hear a song we used to dance to in our small kitchen when we were young and had nothing but each other. After he died, my son insisted I come live with him. I remember feeling so relieved. I thought, this is what family means. This is what I worked for. I moved into his home, a comfortable house in a quiet American suburb, with manicured lawns and neighbors who waved politely but rarely spoke beyond a greeting. I finally met his wife properly, though we had known each other for years, and I grew close to my 2 grandchildren, whose laughter filled that house with a kind of joy I hadn't felt since my son was small. I had my own retirement income, modest but enough to cover my needs, and I insisted on contributing to the household expenses, even though my son told me it wasn't necessary. I didn't want to be a burden. I never wanted to be a burden. That fear lived in me quietly, always, even in the happiest moments. For the first few years, things were good. I helped in the kitchen. I told my grandchildren stories about India, about gods and demons and brave queens, the same stories my own mother had told me. My son hired a caregiver to look after me during the hours he and his wife were at work, someone to keep me company, to help with small errands, to make sure I took my medications on time. I thought it was thoughtful. I thought it meant he still saw me as someone worth caring for. I didn't yet understand that convenience and love can look identical from the outside, while meaning something entirely different underneath. As the years passed, my body began to betray me in small ways. I would misplace my glasses and spend an hour searching, only to find them on top of my own head. I needed a hand climbing the stairs some mornings, my knees stiff and protesting. Some nights, the pain in my legs would wake me, and I would sit at the edge of my bed in the darkness, breathing through it alone, not wanting to disturb anyone. None of this affected my mind. I was still sharp, still capable of holding conversations, cooking full meals, remembering every relative's birthday and every recipe I'd learned from my own mother decades ago. But small physical needs have a way of growing louder in a household already stretched thin by work, children, and modern life's relentless pace. I began to notice something shifting, though I told myself I was imagining it. A sigh here, a glance exchanged between my son and his wife when I asked for help with something simple, a tightness in the air during doctor's appointments that used to feel routine. I didn't know yet that a storm was gathering. I didn't know that the sacrifices of 36 years, the sleepless nights, the aching hands, the meals I skipped so my son could eat, none of it would be enough to protect me from what was coming. I only knew that I loved my family with everything I had left in me. I had no idea that love, given so completely for so long, could still leave a person standing utterly alone. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house when tension has been living there for a while, even if nobody speaks it out loud. I began to feel that quiet more and more in my son's home. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something softer and somehow more dangerous. A slow withdrawal, the kind that creeps in so gradually you almost convince yourself you're imagining it. My daughter-in-law had always been polite to me, respectful in the way people are respectful to someone they've decided to tolerate rather than embrace. I never blamed her entirely. 2 women running one kitchen, one household, one set of unspoken rules about how things should be done. It was never going to be simple. But over time, I noticed her patience thinning. She began speaking about her lack of freedom, about how every outing had to be planned around my doctor's appointments, my medication schedule, the caregiver's hours. I would hear fragments of conversations through walls, not quite thick enough, her voice tight with frustration, saying things like she couldn't remember the last time they had gone anywhere without worrying about leaving me alone for even a few hours. I understood in a way. Life with small children and aging parents under one roof is not easy. I had lived it myself, caring for my own mother-in-law decades ago in India, though the culture there made space for it differently. Here, in this country, independence was currency, and I could feel myself becoming a debt nobody wanted to keep paying. My son changed too, though it happened so slowly I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. He used to sit with me in the evenings, asking about my day, laughing at old stories I told about his childhood mischief. Gradually, those evenings became shorter. He would glance at his phone while I spoke, distracted, present in body, but somewhere else in mind. I told myself he was simply tired from work, from the demands of providing for his own family. I made excuses for him, the way mothers do, the way I had always done, because loving him unconditionally was the only kind of love I knew how to give. But something in his eyes had started to change when he looked at me. It's hard to explain unless you felt it yourself. The specific ache of realizing that someone who once looked at you with pure adoration has started looking at you like a responsibility, a complication, an item on a list of things to manage. I began to feel it most during my medical appointments. I have arthritis, manageable but persistent, and a mild heart condition that requires monitoring. Nothing life-threatening, nothing unusual for a woman of 76 years. But every appointment seemed to weigh on my son more heavily than the last. He would check his watch, answer work calls in the waiting room, sigh quietly when the doctor recommended another follow-up visit. One evening, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I had gotten up for a glass of water, my footsteps quiet out of habit rather than intention, and I heard my daughter-in-law's voice from the kitchen, sharper than usual. She was saying that they couldn't keep living like this, that their own children deserved a normal life, that every decision, every trip, every weekend plan had to be filtered through what was manageable for someone else. My son's voice was lower, harder to hear, but I caught fragments, words like options and facilities and for her own good. I stood frozen in the hallway, the glass of water forgotten in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I was certain they would hear it through the walls. I told myself I had misunderstood. I told myself these were just words spoken in frustration, the kind every family exchanges during hard days. I went back to my room and lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, praying I was wrong. In the weeks that followed, I tried harder to be less of a presence. I started making my own meals separately so I wouldn't add extra work to the kitchen. I canceled a follow-up appointment I probably shouldn't have canceled, telling myself I felt fine, when really I simply didn't want to be another burden on my son's calendar. I stopped mentioning the pain in my legs at night. I smiled more, complained less, tried to disappear into the background of a household I had once been the center of, back when my son was small, and I was the only person in the world who could soothe him to sleep. But trying to shrink myself didn't change what was already happening beneath the surface. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm approaching before the sky even changes color, a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was being decided about my life without my voice in the room. My grandchildren, at least, remained a comfort. My granddaughter, 7 years old, would climb into my lap in the evenings and ask me to tell her stories about India, about the goddess Durga riding into battle on a lion, fierce and unstoppable. My grandson, still small enough to believe I had magic in my hands, would ask me to make his favorite dish, a simple lentil curry that took me back to my own mother's kitchen every time I cooked it. Those moments kept me afloat during a time when I felt myself slowly sinking beneath a surface no one else seemed to notice. I confided in one person during this time, my old friend from the Indian community here, a woman who had known me for over 20 years and who had become like a sister to me in a country so far from where either of us had been born. She listened to my worries one afternoon over tea, her expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. She told me gently that I needed to prepare myself, that sometimes children, even good children, even children raised with every value we tried to instill in them, could still be shaped by the pressures of modern life into decisions that would break their mother's heart. I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to believe my son. The boy I raised with my own 2 hands could never see me as anything other than the woman who gave up everything for his future. I clung to that belief the way you cling to a rope during a storm, not because it feels strong, but because it's the only thing keeping you from falling. Then came the Saturday morning that changed everything. I remember waking up to sunlight streaming through my curtains, the kind of soft golden light that makes you believe, for just a moment, that the day ahead will be good. I was folding laundry when my son knocked on my door, and when I looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in his eyes for a very long time. He was smiling, genuinely smiling, the way he used to when he was a boy running home from school with good news. He said he wanted to spend the whole day with me, just the two of us, no schedules, no obligations. He said we would drive without any particular destination, the way we used to sometimes when he was young, and I would take him on little adventures to distract him from the loneliness of being an only child in a new country. He said we would have lunch somewhere special, just the two of us, like old times. My heart swelled so full I thought it might burst. All my worries, all my late-night fears, all the overheard conversations I had tried so hard to forget, they melted away in that instant, replaced by a joy so pure it embarrassed me a little. A 76-year-old woman practically giddy at the thought of spending a day with her own son. I dressed carefully that morning. I chose my favorite saree, a deep emerald green with gold embroidery along the edges, one my husband had bought me on our 20th wedding anniversary. I took only my small handbag and the gold necklace he had given me decades ago, the one I wore on special occasions because it made me feel close to him even after he was gone. I remember looking in the mirror before we left, thinking that I looked, for the first time in months, like a woman who mattered to someone. During the drive, I felt happier than I had in years. I told my son stories about when he was little, the time he tried to catch a squirrel in the backyard and ended up falling into the neighbor's flower bed, the time he refused to eat anything but rice and yogurt for an entire month, the time he cried during his first day of kindergarten because he was convinced I wouldn't come back for him. He laughed at each memory, softer laughter than I had heard from him in a long while. And for those precious minutes in the car, I thought perhaps my friend had been wrong. Perhaps I had been foolish to doubt him. Perhaps this was simply proof that no matter how life pressures a family, the bond between a mother and her son could never truly break. I thanked God silently in that car, grateful for every mile, grateful for every memory we shared aloud, grateful to still be given moments like this one after everything life had put us through. I had no idea that within the hour, that gratitude would curdle into something I never could have prepared myself for. I had no idea that the car was not driving toward a memory. It was driving toward an ending. The car slowed as we turned into a driveway lined with neatly trimmed hedges and flowering bushes, the kind of landscaping that looks expensive without trying too hard to show it. Ahead of us stood a large building, modern in design, all soft beige stone and wide glass windows that caught the morning sun. There was a fountain near the entrance, water trickling gently over smooth stones, and a sign near the road with elegant lettering I couldn't quite read from where I sat. I remember turning to my son with a smile still lingering on my face, asking who we were visiting. Perhaps a friend of his, I thought, someone from his office, someone whose parent lived in a community like this. I had heard of such places before, of course, mostly through gossip among the women in our community, hushed conversations about American children who placed their aging parents in facilities run by strangers. I had always listened to those stories with quiet judgment, thinking to myself that such a thing could never happen in a family like mine, a family I had built with my own sacrifice, my own blood and sweat and sleepless nights. My son didn't answer right away. He put the car in park, his hands remaining on the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary, his knuckles slightly pale from gripping it. When he finally turned to look at me, I saw something in his face I had never seen before. Not anger, not coldness, but a kind of tired guilt, the expression of a man who has rehearsed a difficult conversation so many times in his head that saying it out loud finally feels almost like relief. He said we weren't visiting anyone. I asked him what he meant, my voice still light, still hopeful, still clinging to the belief that there was some misunderstanding, some explanation that would make sense of the growing unease tightening in my chest. He said this place had been chosen for me. I don't think I fully understood the words at first, or maybe I understood them perfectly and my mind simply refused to accept them. the way the body sometimes protects itself from a pain too large to absorb all at once. I asked him to repeat what he had said, and when he did, slower this time, more deliberately, each word landed on me like a stone dropped from a great height. He began to explain, his voice unsteady, that he loved me, that this had nothing to do with love, that he simply could no longer manage everything, his job, his children, his marriage, and the growing needs of caring for me. He said the facility had excellent staff, nurses available around the clock, doctors on site, organized activities, other residents my age who could keep me company. He said it would be better for me, better for everyone, that I would make friends, that I would be looked after properly instead of relying on a part-time caregiver and a family stretched too thin to give me the attention I deserved. I sat there in the passenger seat of that car, in my emerald green saree, wearing the gold necklace my husband had given me, and I felt something inside me break in a way I don't think will ever fully heal. It wasn't the idea of the facility itself that broke me. I want to be clear about that because I have thought about this moment more times than I can count in the months since, turning it over and over like a stone in my palm, trying to understand exactly where the wound came from. It wasn't fear of growing old among strangers, though that frightened me too. It was the realization, sudden and complete, that my son had made this decision entirely alone. He had researched facilities, filled out paperwork, planned this entire day, driven me here with a smile on his face, and never once, not a single time, asked me what I wanted for my own life. 36 years I had given this country everything I had. Decades of work with my hands raw from dish soap and hotel linens, of caring for other people's parents while saving every spare coin for my own son's future, of skipping meals, wearing the same clothes for years, working through illness and exhaustion because his opportunities mattered more to me than my own comfort ever could. And in the end, when my body finally began asking for a small fraction of the care I had given so freely to everyone else, I wasn't even given a seat at the table where my own future was being decided. I had become, in the eyes of my own child, a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be honored. I didn't cry in that car, though I felt the pressure of tears building behind my eyes, hot and insistent. I have cried many times in my life, when I left India, when my mother passed without me by her side, when my husband died in his sleep beside me. But something in me refused to cry in that moment. Some old strength I didn't know I still possessed rising up to steady me. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was simply shock, too large for tears. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and I asked my son quietly whether he had considered, even once, asking me first. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked away, out toward the fountain, his jaw tight, and I understood in that silence everything I needed to understand. This decision had never been about consulting me. It had been about managing me, the way you manage an obligation, a bill that needs to be paid, a task that needs to be checked off a list. I asked him to give me a few minutes before we went inside. He agreed, relief visible on his face, as though he believed the hardest part of this conversation was already behind him. He stepped out of the car to take a phone call, probably to update his wife, and I sat there alone with my thoughts, staring at that beautiful building with its trickling fountain and its manicured hedges. A building that was meant to become the final chapter of my story, chosen for me without my consent, without my voice, without so much as a single conversation about what I might have wanted for the years I had left. I thought about my husband in that moment, wondering what he would have said if he could see me sitting there. I thought about my mother, about the way she held my hands at that airport 36 years ago, about the sacrifices that had shaped every decision of my life. I thought about the small apartment I had once dreamed of having someday, a modest space of my own where I could cook what I wanted, sleep when I wanted, live according to my own rhythm rather than someone else's convenience. And somewhere in those quiet minutes alone in that car, something shifted inside me. The grief I felt didn't disappear, but it began to transform into something else entirely, a quiet, steady resolve I hadn't felt in years. When my son returned to the car, phone call finished, I told him I appreciated his honesty. I told him I needed a little more time before making any decisions about admission, that I wanted to walk around the grounds alone first, to think clearly. He seemed surprised by my calmness, perhaps expecting tears, anger, pleading. I gave him none of those things. I simply stepped out of the car, smoothed the folds of my saree, and walked toward the entrance of that beautiful building, my small handbag clutched in one hand. I want to tell you that I walked inside, sat down with an administrator, and calmly signed whatever papers were necessary. But that isn't what happened. Instead, I kept walking. Past the entrance, past the fountain, down the winding path that led around the side of the building toward a small parking area where visitors could wait for ride shares. My legs ached with every step, the arthritis in my knees protesting the pace I had set for myself, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back toward the car where my son sat waiting, likely assuming I was simply taking a moment to process everything before returning to accept my fate. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew would answer without asking too many questions first. My old friend picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, and I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that I needed her help. I told her where I was. I told her what had happened, and I told her something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until the words left my mouth. I told her I wasn't going inside that building. Not today. Not ever. I didn't yet know what would come next. Whether I had somewhere to go, whether I had the strength at 76 years old to build a new life from nothing in a country that already felt like it had used up everything I had to offer. I only knew, with a certainty that surprised even me, that I would not let this be the way my story ended, decided by someone else, without my voice, without my consent, as though the woman who had given everything had finally become nothing more than an inconvenience to be quietly relocated. For the first time since I left my mother at that airport 36 years ago, I made a decision entirely for myself, and I had absolutely no idea, standing there in that parking lot with my heart pounding and my hands shaking, that this decision would change not only the rest of my life, but the lives of everyone I loved. My friend arrived within the hour, her car pulling into that parking lot like a small miracle. I climbed in without a single glance back toward the building where my son still waited, likely growing confused, perhaps even worried, by how long I was taking. I didn't feel guilt in that moment, though I expected to. I felt something closer to relief, the kind of relief that comes after holding your breath for far too long. My friend didn't ask many questions on the drive. She simply reached over, squeezed my hand once, and told me everything would be all right. I wanted so badly to believe her, though a part of me, the tired and frightened part, wondered whether 76 years old was too late to start rebuilding a life from nothing. That evening, my phone rang more times than I could count. My son's name appeared on the screen again and again, and each time, I let it ring until it stopped. I wasn't punishing him, not exactly. I simply needed silence, space to breathe without his voice pulling me back into a decision I no longer trusted him to make on my behalf. Eventually, he sent a message, short and full of confusion, asking where I had gone, whether I was safe. I typed back only a few words, telling him I was safe, that I needed time, and that I would speak with him when I was ready. The following weeks were among the hardest and, strangely, most liberating of my life. My friend helped me find a small apartment not far from her own home, modest but bright, with a kitchen window that let in soft afternoon light. It wasn't much, a single bedroom, simple furniture donated by members of our community once word quietly spread about my situation. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, every decision within those four walls belonged entirely to me. I won't pretend the transition was easy. There were nights I lay awake in that unfamiliar bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, missing my grandchildren's laughter, missing even the small, complicated comfort of being under the same roof as my son, despite everything that had happened. Loneliness has its own particular weight, heavier some nights than others, and I felt it pressing down on me more than once during those early weeks. But slowly, almost without noticing, life began to fill the empty spaces around me. Word spread through our community that I had moved into my own place, and soon, old friends I hadn't seen in years began stopping by, bringing food, sitting with me for hours over cups of chai, listening to stories I hadn't had the chance to tell in a very long time. I began cooking again, not out of obligation or to avoid burdening anyone, but because I genuinely wanted to. I made the dishes my mother taught me decades ago, filling my small kitchen with the smell of cumin and mustard seeds, of simmering lentils and fresh coriander. I started hosting small gatherings for other women in the community, many of them widows like myself, many of them carrying quiet burdens they rarely spoke about. We would sit together in my little apartment, sharing food, sharing memories, sometimes sharing grief neither of us had fully processed. I discovered, to my surprise, that I still had so much to offer the world, even at 76 years old, even after everything that had happened. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time inside my son's house. Usefulness that wasn't tied to obligation, joy that wasn't shadowed by guilt, independence that felt less like loneliness and more like freedom. Meanwhile, though I didn't witness it directly, I later learned through pieces of conversation and the occasional visit from my grandchildren that the house I had left behind had grown quiet in an entirely different way. My granddaughter, only 7 years old, apparently asked repeatedly why her grandmother no longer lived with them, why the stories about brave queens and powerful goddesses had stopped, why the kitchen no longer smelled the way it used to on weekend mornings. My grandson, still small enough to believe in magic, reportedly cried the first few nights, asking when I would come back to make his favorite lentil curry. My daughter-in-law, I heard, grew unexpectedly unsettled by my absence. The freedom she had hoped for didn't arrive the way she imagined it would. The house felt hollow rather than peaceful, and the problems she believed my presence had caused didn't disappear once I was gone. If anything, new tensions emerged, ones that had perhaps always existed beneath the surface, but had been easier to blame on an aging mother-in-law than to face directly. As for my son, I learned much later, through long conversations we eventually had, that the weeks following that Saturday were among the most difficult of his own life. He told me that the silence in the house without me felt suffocating, that he found himself replaying our conversation in that car over and over, hearing his own words with a clarity he hadn't possessed in the moment he spoke them. He said he began to understand, slowly and painfully, that he hadn't lost his mother on the day I walked away from that facility. He had lost her, in some deeper sense, months earlier, the moment he stopped seeing me as the woman who sacrificed everything for his future and started seeing me only as a complication to be managed. He told me he cried alone in his car more than once during those weeks, unable to explain to his wife or even fully to himself why guilt sat so heavily on his chest. He said he began remembering small things, the way I used to wait up for him no matter how late he came home from college, the way I never once complained about the years of exhausting work that funded his education, the way I had given up my own comfort so completely and so quietly that he had almost forgotten it had ever been a sacrifice at all. 3 months after I left that parking lot, my son showed up at my apartment unannounced. I remember opening the door and seeing him standing there, looking smaller somehow than I remembered, older too, worry etched into features that used to only show me joy. He didn't ask to come inside right away. He simply stood there and told me he was sorry, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a young boy afraid of losing me. I invited him in. We sat together in my small kitchen, the same kitchen that had become the heart of my new life, and for the first time in longer than either of us could remember, we spoke honestly with one another. He told me everything, the pressure he had felt, the arguments at home, the fear of failing his own children while trying to care for his mother, the shame that had grown heavier with each passing week of my absence. I listened without interrupting, the way I had listened to him as a child, though this time the stakes felt entirely different. I told him, gently but honestly, that I understood the weight he had been carrying, that raising children while caring for aging parents is one of the hardest balances life demands of anyone. But I also told him that understanding his burden didn't erase the pain of feeling discarded, of realizing that decades of sacrifice hadn't earned me even a single conversation about my own future. He asked quietly whether there was any way back for us as a family. I looked at my son that afternoon, this man I had carried inside me, nursed through illness, sacrificed everything to raise, and I felt love for him that had never once disappeared, even during the darkest moments of that Saturday morning. But I also felt something new, something I had never possessed before in our relationship, a sense of my own worth that no longer depended entirely on being needed by him. I told him that yes, There was a way back, but it would have to be different this time. I would not return to being someone quietly managed, decisions made about my life without my voice in the room. If our family was going to heal, it would have to be built on respect, not obligation, on genuine relationship rather than convenient arrangement. He agreed, and slowly, over the following months, we began rebuilding something new between us. I still live in my own apartment, surrounded by the community and independence I discovered when I thought my life was ending in that parking lot. My grandchildren visit often, filling my small kitchen with laughter once again. My son and I speak regularly now, real conversations, the kind where he actually asks what I think, what I want, what I need, rather than simply deciding on my behalf. I think back sometimes to that Saturday morning, to the drive I believed was simply a day of joy with my son, to the moment my whole world seemed to collapse in a parking lot outside a beautiful building that was never meant to be my choice. I understand now that sometimes the most painful moments in life are the ones that finally force us to discover our own strength, buried beneath decades of sacrifice we never questioned. At 76 years old, I learned that growing old doesn't mean disappearing. It doesn't mean becoming a burden simply because your body asks for a little more care than it once did. I gave my son everything I had for 36 years in this country. And in the end, what saved me wasn't waiting for him to remember my worth. It was remembering it myself.